morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I see we're getting through the Slido. Hopefully we'll announce those results shortly. But before that, my name is Atiya Karmali. I'm very happy to be here today with my colleague Florian Skeen to talk about MALENA, or IFC's Machine Learning, Environment, Social, and Corporate Governance Analyst. MALENA is an artificial intelligence-powered virtual analyst and analytics platform that IFC's created to read and review technical text. So I'm seeing a message that the volume isn't working. Can folks hear me still? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you great. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So going back to the reasons for why we created MALENA, why do we need an AI application to, go back to the previous slide. So again, speaking to our Slido, why do we need an artificial intelligence application to do this? And I think you're calling the Slido results.
Yes.
While those come up, the answer should be 180 million years. That's how long it would take to download all of the data on the internet. And just that staggering fact alone, the question then would be, how do you pass through all that data? And then the additional fact that most of that data is what's described as unstructured. So that's video, audio, text documents, like Word files, PDFs, this PowerPoint. So it's an endless universe of information that you have to dig through. And so an artificial intelligence solution seems like the right way to go. Hopefully, you'll see why that has then led to the problem we're seeking to solve, which is to develop a solution for natural language processing, which is a type of artificial intelligence that allows computers to understand written and spoken text, essentially to read and listen to text. And then the fact that this can be a game changer. Certainly a game changer for the work that I'm doing now. I think that a lot of the participants on the call are involved with, which is around environmental and social risk assessment, risk management, and a need to rapidly and at scale analyze unstructured information. So today we hope to show you how MALENA can do this for your work in two significant ways. The first is by helping to identify and assess over 1,200 sustainability risk terms identified by IFC sustainability standards. So that's really taking IFC's sustainability DNA captured in our performance standards, IFC's corporate governance methodology, and extracting over 1,200 risk areas that you can identify in text. And the second is by delivering this analytical capacity at scale that would be impossible for a human to deliver. So I myself couldn't believe this statistic, but we put together a website in advance of this webinar. And one of the statistics we have up there is that the model can analyze 19,000 documents per minute, which is astonishing, certainly to me, and just shows how this capacity can really support and enable our work. And then there are several use cases for this technology. The two that we will share today are two applications that we tested the technology solution on. The first is the use of company sustainability disclosures, and the second is environmental and social impact assessment documents. So in the first case, it's really trying to address a question we're looking at in terms of identifying information that's publicly available. And the second case is where you're again looking at publicly available information, but really examining a technical text. And we wanted to make sure that we were able to, the model was successfully able to do both types of use cases. And I expect by the end of the session, and I hope by the end of the session, we'll have a number of other ideas from the audience about ways in which we can apply this solution. Today, we'll also talk a little bit about natural language processing and how we went about the approach of model training, and then also talk about important considerations to us and to, I think, anybody developing these types of solutions, which are around managing data bias, managing and tracking model performance, and then ensuring that we continuously work towards increasing explainability as well as trustworthiness. And finally, before we get going, this project has been in the works for 3 years now. It's flown by and has been developed with the assistance of a number of donors, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark and the Ministry of Economy and Finance of the Republic of Korea. We're extremely grateful to all our donor partners for their support with advancing this work. So now the next slide, please. That's somewhat, okay, there we go. So here, this again lays out the use case that I just introduced, which is, but also begs the question, why a development finance institution with the mandate to invest in the private sector and emerging markets is creating bespoke AI solutions. The first factor is just the enabling environment. The breakthroughs or the current breakthrough in all things artificial intelligence that everybody is talking about have really been catalyzed by advances in an area known as machine learning. And this has applications, this has made these applications accessible to a much wider audience, including stodgy bureaucrats who can find ways to take advantage of this. And here I'm talking about myself alone. Not Florian. And Florian will go into more detail today about how machine learning works, but very simply put, machine learning involves training computers to perform tasks based on learning from examples. So machine learning, rather than relying on programming by a human. And then this information is used by computers to perform tasks. For example, when you have algorithms that learn from historical data sets of loan terms, loan amounts, defaults, in order to predict borrower defaults in the future. So you have access to this really interesting technology, and the other side of the puzzle is data, which is the resource that makes machine learning possible. So these examples that machines learn from are all based in data. And this brings us to the second enabling factor, which is that as the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in emerging markets, IFC's project documentation archive includes text describing ESG performance, outcomes, benchmarks for emerging markets going back decades. And this archive encompasses more than 3 million documents for over 50,000 projects. Make sure I get this right, covering 175 countries and 33 investment sectors. So it's a really diverse and deep archive of both structured, which is numbers, and unstructured, which is, again, text-based archive of the historical performance of companies, countries, sectors in emerging markets. And so this combination of access to IFC's historical data archive, technology solution, and then a third leg of the stool in a sense, which is ESG expertise. So we have this wide and deep pool of IFC specialists in the sustainability space, but as well as in climate, gender, biodiversity, impact investing, who we can leverage to try to improve model performance. So you're really taking IFC's ESG intelligence and embedding it into an artificial intelligence solution that can then amplify that effect. And so this historical archive, access to technology, and we have some other good lessons learned around other ways in which similar institutions who are interested in leveraging data science can do this. And then the in-house expertise actually makes development finance institutions like IFC excellent incubators to create custom supervised machine learning models. And this, of course, has benefits for IFC operations, allowing us to be more efficient. And at the end of the session today, we'll talk a little bit about the number of profiles we've been able to generate, the information we have for use by IFC's specialist group internally. But also, more significantly, this allows us to make this analytical capacity available to other stakeholders, investors, as well as other stakeholders working in emerging markets to help us and then help really IFG achieve its development mandate, which is development finance. And by providing this information to investors and other stakeholders, to ensure that this development finance includes ESG integration. And then, if we can go to the next slide, please. Reinforcing that use case for IFC, which is we have natural language processing, we have access to this kind of capacity. And then, the question is like, why is it so important now in terms of the investment world? Is an investment thesis that we've been advancing for some time now, both on the investment side, we're actually making investments in and through asset manager organized vehicles to actually deliver impact in emerging markets. And the reason we're doing this is that IFC, and there's empirical evidence out there, as well as studies, believes in this argument that in order to alleviate poverty and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, you need to make investments in emerging markets where the development needs are the greatest. And here, estimates place the annual SDG funding gap at between $2 to $3 trillion. Another really huge statistic. But in contrast, you have 200 trillion in global financial assets invested in capital markets globally. And this amount is 900 times, in fact, the amount of investments made by multilateral development banks and development finance institutions. So asset owners and asset managers who sit on large pools of institutional finance can play a transformative role in helping achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by investing in emerging market capital markets. And more significantly, we've seen research as well as empirical evidence from the past 2 years that finds that ESG and impact performance strategies to make investment selections actually do not sacrifice returns. IFC has published information about its own history of investing using ESG and outperformance. But this also enhances portfolio performance both by lowering risk as well as reducing volatility. And in fact, a report that came out just 2 days ago by the European Securities Market Association found that ESG funds outperformed their conventional non-ESG peers while also being cheaper. So, as that, so we continue to sort of see that there's a way to combine impact investing with ESG integrated investing in a way that's can help achieve development outcomes. However, asset owners and asset managers interested in developing such ESG integrated investment strategies cite data and performance benchmarks as significant obstacles to sustainable long-term investing. So that, again, takes us back to this data use case. And these data constraints stem from inconsistencies between reporting standards, the absence of reporting standards, issues with data access, availability, scoring methodologies, standards not being uniform, the use of different indicators and definitions of materiality, and the list goes on. And so we see that combined with some significant reporting burdens on issuers, and that's some work that we're also working on around helping issuers seamlessly disclose information that can then feed into different reporting frameworks. And while we're seeing an increased emphasis on this convergence, we're still a ways away from this. And then the last point, explaining the use, sort of getting back behind the use case is the absence of data coverage for emerging markets and why it's so important that this solution developed as a result of emerging market data is so important for emerging markets because ESG data coverage is available mostly for developed markets. And again, unsurprising since that's where most of the investments are taking place. These findings were also reinforced by our own research, which we'll talk about later in the session. And then again, going back to that, the statistic we began with, which is just the size and depth of unstructured information. And that evidence that finally, the good news, evidence that says that there's research that finds that investors in emerging markets actually underestimate the value of information that is available in unstructured data. And here again, news articles, annual integrated and sustainability reports, bond prospectuses. And this is one of the case studies we'll be talking about later today. And so our argument is that once organized, this information and the outputs from this underutilized, unstructured data can be analyzed to derive insights for ESG risks, and we use IFC's ESG taxonomy to do this. And you're able to do multiple things. You can identify high-risk issuers. We'll show you an example of why we believe that's possible. Issuers who are well-placed to transition to green finance. And so there are multiple applications, and we'll talk about those in some detail later today. But now, before I'm going to take a break from talking and hand over to Florian, for Florian to talk more about natural language processing, how Malena does this in practice, and then also how we went about training the model, and most importantly, ensuring that we have high levels of accuracy, but that the information is easy to understand and the results are transparent and trustworthy. Okay, Florian, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Atiya. And as Atiya mentioned in the very beginning, we have an incredible amount of data floating around our universe, the world right now, and 80% of that is estimated to be unstructured. Now, historically, if you think about unstructured data, videos, audio, text, all of that kind of data, it's been quite hard to analyze that at scale. I mean, we can all read a document, that's pretty straightforward, but try to do that for 100 documents, 1,000 documents, 10,000 documents, and pretty soon, with the tools that we used to have available, we reached a limit of what we could do and how we could analyze that unstructured data. But recent years have given us the opportunity, or have delivered tools to do that. I mean, we were talking about just incredible developments in the cloud computing space. Machine learning is quite heavy on computational steps. And so having new chip technology and having new cloud computing technology makes it more accessible. And also having better algorithms that are able to execute a lot of steps simultaneously have really unlocked a new way of thinking about machine learning and analyzing unstructured data. We talk about natural language processing specifically because in the ESG context, as we all know, and as Atiya already mentioned, annual reports, sustainability reports, bond prospectuses, financials, news reports, social media, impact assessments, those are all written unstructured text, written information that is floating out there and contains a good amount of information, ESG relevant information that previously we were struggling to get our hands on. So with the help of cloud computing and with the help of very, very impressive research that has yielded new models, new ways of analyzing text, new ways of analyzing and understanding the context of text that we analyze. We at the IFC and the MALENA project, we're utilizing a few common NLP techniques to do that, and we'll dive into one of those in more detail. But some of the common NLP techniques that really help us unlock text and make sense of text are displayed on the slide, where we have named entity recognition, which helps us identify entities, and entities could be locations, companies, even individual organizations or individuals. In text, which was previously quite hard to do because of the just variety of entities that we could be interested in, and that helps us map content to those entities. And that is specifically important in the emerging markets context, where a lot of the data is out there, but it's not necessarily mapped to any entity. And therefore, when you talk about news articles, social media, it's a very powerful tool that we utilize and have experimented with. Now, similarly, topic modeling helps us understand amongst all the text that we analyze, what topics it refers to, what the key concepts in that text are. And so it helps us identify relevant content. It helps us identify and group content and build relationships amongst them or amongst content. And then we have sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis has really been on the rise for a few years now in a number of contexts. And it's the main sort of NLP tool that we use in the context of MALENA, where we use sentiment analysis to classify ESG content by positive, negative, or neutral sentiment to detect ESG risk or ESG performance for the documents that we analyze. And so really the takeaway is that, and I know that from my personal experience, I was involved in a research project 10 years ago where we tried to analyze political speeches and their impact on voter sentiment and voter behavior. I mean, doing this project now, I wish we had those technologies 10 years ago. It would have made our life a lot easier, and it would have allowed us to do things that we just weren't able to do 10 years ago, and that now we are. And so we're very lucky to have those tools available, and are really enjoying making good use of them. The idea behind Malena is really to say that the ESG data gap that is always referred to is twofold. One part of it is that in some cases there is no data, and then even the best tools won't allow you to analyze that data if there is none. But in many cases there is data out there, but it's just not accessible. We don't have the right tools to analyze it. We don't have the right tools to analyze the data at scale. And so the idea behind Malena is really to take the data that is out there already and unlock it, and unlock all the information that is in impact assessments that are 50 pages long. I mean, try to read that yourself. It'll take some time to get through that, and to really unlock the data that is out there, analyze it, structure it, and make it available to specialists, to investors, to make better decisions. We do that using sentiment analysis and NLP technique. As Atia mentioned, we use a number of keywords, we call them risk terms, to identify relevant content. And then whenever we identify and locate relevant content, we analyze the context in which it appears, and the model predicts whether this is positive, negative, or neutral. And then you turn that data into information, because all of a sudden you don't have a document just of 50 pages anymore, but you have a couple hundred ESG signals that tell you this is positive, this is negative, and all of that then obviously has metadata that can be linked to a project, to a client, to a region, sector, to a specific time, which if you do it for one document is powerful, but if you do it for a few thousand documents, all of a sudden you build a really interesting database that you can interrogate in many different ways. Still sounds very vague. I mean, you see a nice graphic here and lots of colors. How does it work in practice? What do we actually do? And that's an example here, or we actually have two examples of positive and negative sentiments that hopefully will make it a little bit more tangible what we mean when we talk about sentiment analysis. So as I explained, we use over 1,200 terms to identify relevant content, and that's across all of IFC's 8 performance standards, the 6 corporate governance methodology topics. We have climate risk terms in there. We're working on gender terms. So we really try to capture the broad ESG content, and you do that by keywords and all their variations. So if you see on the slide, we see words such as community and hazards and noise and penalties and fatalities. So all the different types of ESG content that one could be interested in. And then whenever that content is identified, the model assesses the sentence. And it's truly the model reads the sentence, tries to understand the context, and based on the context, predict whether for this specific risk term, this is positive or negative from an ESG perspective. So if we take the first example here, where we have a word community highlighted in red, the sentence is a little long and convoluted, but in essence, it tells us that the community raised some concerns around the project location because it would potentially endanger their livelihoods. Now, this is a negative context. It's not as straightforward as there is a risk for the community. There's a little bit of natural language around it, but the model was able to correctly identify that this is a potential risk for the community, and so assess this as a negative sentiment for community. And similarly, here in the bottom, we see that if a sentence tells us, or if a document tells us, the environmental and social impact assessment identified a number of key issues, and their noise and fugitive emissions and hazards, the model again identifies that content, and based on the context of the sentence, understands that this is a negative sentiment. Now, negative sentiment is an ESG risk or an ESG performance gap. But the real value here is that it's not static based on the terms. I mean, we love the example of child labor or fatalities. Those are quote unquote bad words, and whenever we hear them or whenever they appear in a document, we may sound the alarm bells. But that's not true, right? Because if the context tells us that there's no risk for that, there's an absence of that risk, or that the company did not receive any penalties, did not receive any fines, and there were no fatalities, as we see here on the right-hand side, then that's actually a positive sentiment. That's a positive ESG performance, or the absence of an ESG performance risk. And therefore, we trained the model to identify that as a positive sentiment and as a positive ESG signal. What that allows us to do is to really cut out the noise. If we're interested in ESG risks, we look only at negative sentiment. If we look at more the positive performance, the positive impact, we can look at positive sentiments. And it allows us to structure data in a completely new way when it comes to ESG content, and to really turn these keywords that previously may have just been data points saying the word community appears in this document into ESG signals saying the word community appears in the document in a negative sentiment or in a negative context, which then is a signal rather than just a data point. The powerful thing about this is also that once you identify those data points and turn them into ESG signals, they're connected to a whole range of metadata. This highlight here will be negative sentiment for community. Community can obviously be mapped to topics, to performance standards, to the SDGs, to SASB framework topics, but it is also linked to a project, to a company, to a region, country, to a specific time in a point in time. And so the database that you build around those individual ESG signals is incredibly powerful and gives you a whole new way of interrogating huge databases of ESG signals. We did that for, and we'll look at that in a few slides. We did that internally for a few thousand documents, and that turns into a few million ESG signals. And if a few years ago somebody would have said, oh, you can relatively easily create a database of a few million ESG signals for companies, projects, issues around the world, that would have sounded a little crazy. But now I think we have tools that are quite capable in doing that. How do we do that? How do we get to this point? How do we train the model? And what was our sort of mission plan to get there? When training a supervised model, and we talk about supervised models, which include training data. So we manually create training data to train the model on, and then assess the model's performance against that training data that we provided. When training a model, a supervised machine learning model, there are a few sort of key concepts that are quite important for that to be successful. I think we learned ourselves, and we can attest to that it doesn't make sense to embark on trying to train a supervised machine learning model and trying to cut corners. In the long run, it will serve you well to have a clear purpose and goal for the model, to really know what you want to use it for. I mean, a lot of times we say, oh, this one model, and then we expect it to do everything under the sun. And we say, oh, but can it also assess this? And can it also maybe have this dimension? And can we also maybe add this piece to the assessment? And it's, in our experience and in the experience of Malena, it is good to have a clear purpose and goal for a specific model and then train it to do that very well, rather than trying to serve every possible use case with one specific model. I'd say the biggest component in training the model is the high quality and large amount of training data. As I said, for a supervised model, you need training data. And in the ESG context, that is ESG text, ESG content labeled by human beings to say, this is the word. And if we go back to the slide that I just showed you, when we say labeling data, we mean that a human being goes into a little software program and the word community will be highlighted and said, this is relevant content. And then a human being goes in and reads the content, reads the context, reads the sentence and says, oh, this is negative for community. And so I will assign a negative sentiment to this manually. You have to do that quite a lot. You have to do that a lot and consistently and following very clear and consistent rules to get high quality training data. And to get a lot of it, you have to do it again and again and again. But then the results speak for themselves. And if you do that well, and if you have good quality controls in place, you can really achieve quite high results and quite impressive results with that approach. For MALENA specifically, what we did is as I said, we went in and we're still going in and labeling that data manually. We built MALENA based on Roberta. Roberta is a model that really a few years ago, the BERT model, the bidirectional encoder representations from transformers was developed by Google, and it was made publicly available and is still publicly available. And Roberta is really an optimized version of that BERT model. But that BERT model changed the way NLP works. It really changed the field. It changed the way we could leverage NLP. It is, I would claim, one of the milestones in NLP development in the last few years. And so it is natural that an optimized version of that milestone model would be our model of choice. And we use that base model, which is really, if you think about it in human terms, is a human being that can understand and read English text. And so we take a human being or a model that can read and understand English text and teach the MALENA model to understand and read ESG specific content. And so MALENA is really an ESG specifically trained Roberta model. We, as I said, repeated our process for creating training data quite a few times. We, at this point, have 125,000 labels. Now, 125,000 labels is quite a lot to begin with, but it is even more when you think that we have a few, let's say, quality control steps built in, where for any training data point, for any label to be used for training the model, at least 2 human labelers, so 2 ESG analysts on our team, have to assign the same label independently and agree on that label to ensure that we don't have any bias in the training data and to ensure that we have the highest possible quality of training data. So we if you double that, that's our output on the training label side. And then we have quality controls in terms of making sure that the level of agreement between our labelers is consistently high. We use inter-annotator agreement levels to monitor that, to make sure that there's no discrepancy in understanding, the rules are clear. We, in addition to using those manually created labels, we have a feedback loop in our internal platform where we leverage the feedback from our user base to identify any weaknesses in the model and retrain the model to do better there. And we have some quality checks to make sure that on an ongoing basis, the data that we use is not skewed in any topic, in any region, in any sort of sentiment, so that we have a quite robust set of training data. At this point, the model performs at 90% accuracy. So again, in layman terms, 9 out of 10 times, the model predicts the correct sentiment. And that is assessed against a subset of the training data. So really against what our ESG specialists would assess. And I think just a quick note on the graph that you see in the bottom right, training an AI model is not a linear process. You can't say if I double the amount of training data, I will have twice the performance. It is definitely a sort of somewhat non-linear process, because if you add new topics, the overall model performance may not grow as quickly. But all in all, the notion stands that if you want to train a high quality or a high performing model, you need a lot of training data, and the more high quality training data you have, the better your model will perform ultimately. When I said we tested the model, we obviously test the model against the labels that our human ESG analysts provide, but we also test the model in real life applications. I mean, we use the model to assess a whole range of documents to make sure that it performs well across all documents. And I think on the first slide or second slide, I mentioned if you do that for thousands of documents, you get a huge database. So to date, we've analyzed 37,000 documents using Malena. 37,000 documents. That's just, I mean, I still struggle to put that in context, trying to see, well, how many hours or days or how much time would it need for humans to try to structure all that data and analyze it. Those 37,000 documents, analyzing Malena, we turned those documents into a database of over 14 million ESG signals. I mean, 14 million ESG signals spanning the last 15 years across, the entire emerging markets universe, across all sectors, across all types of documents. That is incredible. And I would argue that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And that's really one of the takeaways we hope for our audience to take away from today, is that the potential of this solution is close to unlimited. I mean, if we can create a database of 14 million ESG signals from 37,000 documents, just imagine what you can do using Malena. Now, with that kind of analytical power does come some responsibility. And as Atia mentioned, we believe and we hope that everybody agrees with us that there is the need to govern AI, and there is the need to be very thoughtful about how to build AI and to be ethical and sustainable when doing that. We're thankfully not the only ones who think that. We have a whole lot of governing bodies who agree with us, or we agree with them, and there are a lot of standards being developed around that. The IFC developed the draft technology code of conduct for the sustainable development of AI, which is a great read, and maybe I can ask Aditi or Blaze on the chat to post a link to that draft technology code of conduct if possible. And we actually used that code of conduct to assess Malena. We had an independent sort of assessment of Malena using that draft technology code of conduct, and identified a few areas for our own project to be mindful of and to pay attention to, and that's data bias, model drift, and explainable AI. Data bias is really the idea that the model training and inference data, or the model training data, is not really representative of the universe. So if your data set is skewed and is biased towards a sentiment, towards a region, towards a topic, then the AI model may not be representative, or it may not be able to predict representative examples. Model drift is much more around the model, the way it is trained, not going with the data set that is supposed to be applied on. So if your data set, if your target universe changes and you don't adapt your model to change with it, then you have a drift of the model away from the target universe of the data that you want to assess. And then explainable AI goes towards that black box concern around AI. I mean, a lot of times, if you don't know too much about AI, you don't know how exactly a model works. But even if you know a little more about AI, you still don't know exactly why a model will predict one specific outcome. That's because it is not a rules-based approach. There's no one sort of clear connection between input and output. It's all based on statistical weights, and they're adjusted as we feed more training data. And the question of why did the model provide this prediction is always because that's what it was trained to do. So the model will always be make predictions based on the training data. But there are efforts to sort of shine a light into those black boxes, and we've done some explorations on how to try to explain what pieces of the input were most relevant for the prediction of the output. And there are some really interesting developments in that space. So those are the three areas that we focus on, and we're working on a Malena data and model governance framework to proactively manage the ethical and sustainable development of Malena, and are very mindful of that, and are thankful to all our colleagues who have pointed us in that direction and keep supporting us in that. Now, having sort of killed the mood a little bit with the ethical and sustainable concerns, we do want to hear from you. I think we're about to launch another poll around your concerns when it comes to the use of AI, and we will also use that time to, while we launch the poll, to have a quick Q&A, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Aditi Jagtiani for a few questions from the chat, and a reminder to please continue to post your questions in the chat so we can pick them up and answer them.
Thanks, Florian. Great to hear from you, Anatya. So we have some really nice questions in the chat, and we have question answer time now and at the end. So we'll try and answer some now, and then we'll get to the rest later. So the first question is all sector data included in the database?
I can take that one maybe, and then Florian, I'll punt to you, or Blaze, in fact. And I want to also take this opportunity to introduce our team, Aditi Jagtiani, who works on everything on our team and keeps us all on the straight and narrow, but has also been a big piece of the work that we've been doing on the data side, as well as Blaze Sanwidi, who is the data scientist on our team and has really helped with creating the Malena intelligence. And then that goes back to this, again, the question of data to learn from. So, and I also saw another question in the chat about how we balance data. So of course we have the data that for industries that IFC has invested in, which is pretty much, which in a sense tracks the development of emerging markets. So you see that we are quite BRIC centric in terms of managing data bias, and then also actually reflective of the sectors that IFC has invested in. And you'll see a big shift in the last few years, also towards, or enough of a shift in the last few years where there's been, where financial markets has continued to be a big part of IFC's balance sheet, but then we also invest across, the direct sector. And our portfolio also reflects this focus towards decarbonization, the green economy. And so it's a bit of a balance. And then just to answer another question that I saw, how would you manage that? A big piece of that is collaborating with other institutions that have the data sets that we need. So working with regional development finance institutions that have a regional focus, which also can help us with balancing data.
Great. Thank you, Aditi and Florian. Another great question. Is there any research that IFC has published on the ESG business case? Does it provide evidence on the importance of having tools that allow for greater ESG integration in investment deals?
So, and we'll be talking about it right after this. Hopefully we'll answer that question as we go through the examples, especially the first one.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually post a report in the chat just in advance of that. Okay, great. How long did it take you to develop and implement Malena?
Florian, I think that's one for you. I don't know if we'd have the same answer, but you can take a crack at that one.
Thank you, Atia. And the question is really, are we even done yet? I feel like developing AI is one of those never-ending stories, and you can always refine and you can always tweak, and there are always additional use cases. But I think we can sort of say that the earnest work started about 2.5 years ago. I know that quite well because that's when I joined IFC for this project. So I remember that sort of time frame. The first few months were a little sort of just slow getting the project up and running. So I think the sort of full steam development of Malena has been taking place for a little over 2 years now. I think that's a fair sort of estimation of how long it's taken us to get to this point.
Okay, thanks, Florian. In what ways can Malena's output be used to look for more donors and investments for emerging markets? Could you share some examples of key topics of interest where Malena was useful on this?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, fortunately, we're focusing on the expertise of the department that Florian and I are associated with, which is IFC's ESG department. So environment, social and corporate governance, and we're the department that develops that integrates these standards into client operations. But IFC, of course, is much broader than that. And there's this large pool of experts who also work on the investment side. So the idea is for us to continue to progressively, as Florian said, continue to expand. So this project never really feels like it's ending, but to try to leverage the expertise of our colleagues. And an area where we're hoping to do that starting our next fiscal year, which is July, is climate as well as gender. Those are both strategic investment areas for IFC. And then, of course, we also have some deep expertise in biodiversity finance. So those would be areas we'd want to focus on, but we don't have that as yet in terms of helping identify investment targets, but it's very much a focus for us, something that we hope to be able to address in the next fiscal year. And will again be reflective of IFC's impact data. So, the development rationale and then the development impact associated with that investment, which are the other two parts of IFC's approach to triple bottom line investing. That's a great question. Thank you. And a reminder that we have lots of work in the new year.
That's right, we do. So I'm going to pose one more question before we move on because I'm cognizant of the time. So the question is, how does the machine recognize, validate, weight facts-based information or data versus biased information populating the web? Will the results from Malena inform users of the quality of the information analyzed?
Interesting question. Florian, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Aditi, for picking that question, because it is a really interesting point. Now, the model itself is not, and that goes back to have a clear and concise targets for what the model can do. The model is not supposed to identify whether the content is reliable or not. But there are some sort of pre-processing steps that we implement on our end, and I think that are always, and many people do that already, I would assume, are important to make sure that you have high quality content. So we have an ESG data strategy to make sure that we bring in high quality data, we bring in reliable and trustworthy sources. We use a bit of a scoring for reliability on our end to say certain sources are very reliable and certain sources may be slightly biased, and then that flows into a potential scoring or a potential rating based on that data. I do think, though, that the power is of the model is in the scalable analysis, and then if you put the right safeguards in place in the pre-processing step to say this type of data source is known to be reliable and this type of data source is potentially slightly biased, you can very much have that flow into your final assessment, and that's how we handle it, and think we've fared well, pretty well so far.
Thanks, Florian, and thanks, Satya. I think let's go forward with the rest of the presentation, and then we'll come back to more questions at the end. And thanks, everyone, for your questions. Keep them coming.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Aditi. And I'm going to try and get through these slides pretty quickly so we have some time towards the end to chat. But a lot of really good questions, and I hope this, the next few slides will answer the question about how we've applied the model to date. So the first case study that we looked at was for emerging market issuers. Again, going back to this argument that we're making, that by redirecting institutional finance, asset owners and asset managers can help meet the sustainable development goals in emerging markets. And so one of our first case studies that we looked at was actually looking at whether we could score emerging market issuers. This would be applicable to any scoring of any type of corporate. Does not have to be an issuer necessarily. So any company that you want to score, you can score in this manner. And then also we wanted to sort of see whether this argument that there's more juice to unstructured data than has been accounted for was accurate. So a reminder that for each risk term detected and every sentiment predicted, MALENA generates corresponding probabilities of the confidence level of the prediction. So this is at the risk term level. You can aggregate this information at the sentence, document, company, sector, country, and then develop analytics in that fashion that basically communicate the sentiment score for either a risk term or the text that it's in. And then this output can be reviewed to understand basic things like how much positive to negative sentiment in a document, and then also look at absolute as well as relative levels. And we did this study with our investment partner, Amundi Asset Management, and the idea really here was to compare scores generated by MALENA with scores that Amundi had for this group of financial institutions. We looked at a group of 804 financial institutions that were issuers of hard currency debt. This was a sample taken from a report that IFC produced in 2020. We were able to identify data for about half that universe. And you can see that broken down here, the kind of document types we were able to identify. It was over 1,200 documents. And Amundi had scores for about 25% of this universe, so 205 of these financial institutions. And an important statistic that we were actually able to identify here was that we were not able to detect ESG data disclosures for about 45% of the universe. So, again, useful information for our colleagues working to try to expand disclosure in emerging markets in terms of ESG. And we wanted to look at three things. And if we go to the next slide, please. Which shows the results. We wanted to look at whether MALENA was able to produce results from short-term sources, so news articles primarily, whether MALENA could derive signals from short as well as long-term, so by long-term, anything over a year. And again, that's annual sustainability integrated reports. And of course, in the case, because this was about fixed income, we were also able to access bond prospectuses. And then finally, the sort of million-dollar question was if MALENA could actually increase the investable universe. And we had some very interesting results. First, we found that MALENA was actually able to identify controversy scores based on short-term signals, and that for Amundi's medium and high-risk controversy scores, there was a high level of correlation with the MALENA sentiment scores. Where the model differed was in the case of low controversy scores. So for 16 of the 18 companies identified as low controversy by Amundi, the model actually was more, or the model had identified greater negative sentiment that would actually have bumped those companies up to being a high or medium risk. And then, of course, one of the reasons for that could just be given the short-term signal nature of it, could be the fact that the sentiment signals were identified at a different point in time. However, it was interesting that the model actually felt that there was a greater amount of controversy than had been previously identified. And then for the second piece, which is whether MALENA could do this for longer-term news sources, or longer-term data sources, we actually found that MALENA was able to validate Amundi scores both for aggregated, so ESG scores, as well as disaggregated ES and G scores. And there are additional insights that I would urge folks to take a look at when you have a chance to read the report. And then this, of course, has implications for the ability for investors to use MALENA to validate their own as well as third-party assessments of company performance and just provide an independent assessment. And then finally, one of the more interesting pieces, of course, certainly for us in the validation that there is certainly more to unstructured data, was the fact that MALENA could produce 236 additional scores for information for issuers that Amundi did not have. And this actually both made the argument for the use case we're advancing, that unstructured data is underused, but also succeeded in doubling the amount of information that Amundi had about these issuers, which we felt was significant. And then, as Florian's already explained, you can look at this information in a number of different ways, including by regions, and also then at the individual topic or risk term area. So we have more illustrations in the paper that explain how you can interpret this information. And then again, here our argument is that investors can use this information in a number of different ways. Of course, there's just managing the vast amount of information that's out there, but then additionally, this information can be used to set priorities, meet stewardship goals, as well as engagement strategies when you're looking at fixed income. And again, please take a look at the paper, give us your feedback, let us know your thoughts. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is our second use case, which was applying this to environmental and social impact assessments. And Florian talked about how it would be great to have had a tool like this 10 years ago. In my case, it would have been 20 years ago at my first job, which was doing working as an environmental specialist in an infrastructure finance company that looked at project finance. And I read a lot of environmental impact assessment reports, and it would have been great to have had an algorithm do a first pass. The results of this study will be published in a peer-reviewed paper that is going to be included in a handbook of environmental impact assessment, slated to be published later this year by Edward Eldor Publishing. So for folks who are going to have some raised eyebrows at some of the things we're going to say, we're just saying that we had other people look at this, and this did pass peer review, but we had some very, again, interesting results in this one as well. We looked at a set of environmental and social impact assessment disclosures made through IFC's disclosure portal for 530 projects. That was about 1,300 documents, and environmental and social impact assessment reports were about 40% of the entire sample. Firstly, MALENA was able to identify about 85% of the taxonomy we had in place at the time, which was significant. And then most of the words were actually identified in environmental and social impact assessment reports. Again, not surprising given the size of these reports and what we know about technical content. But the model was able to, again, identify a number of, make a number of predictions. It had over 100,000 positive, as well as, it had over 200,000 positive, over 100,000 negative, and over 1 million neutral signals from all of this information. So it was really, again, if nothing else, it identified the ability for these types of algorithms to organize massive amounts of unstructured information. And then again, we calculated sentiment predictions at the project level to then see what additional insights we could get from this information. We found two very interesting insights. The first, we found that there was a high level of correlation between environmental and social impact assessment documents that had a higher proportion of positive sentiment with portfolio performance later in the project. And we did this by establishing correlation between these scores and IFC's environmental and social risk ratings. These are scores assigned by IFC in portfolio. And then we also found that the environmental and social impact assessment reports, the sentiment scores of these were significant predictors of future performance. And I'm really glad that my colleague Blaise Sanwiti is on the line to answer questions around how we came to that conclusion. I can tell you we had a lot of skeptics in our department in IFC saying that they were not sure how we could see those results. However, at a minimum, we think that this makes the case for algorithms like this to be classifiers of project information early in the process. You can at least identify the projects with the potential for high risk. And then again, use this to direct resources, technical capacity, develop environmental and social action plans. The next slide, please. So this brings us to the use case that we're proposing for MALENA for emerging market investors. Florian's talked about a lot of these. The ones that I'll just highlight here are, again, what we believe is possible in terms of time and cost savings, but really how we feel like this information can help analyze information that's out there and make it accessible to investors that are interested in investing in emerging markets. We have a beta testing underway at present. We would be delighted if we could add to this list. So if we have investors or folks who think they have an interesting investment use case for the use of Malena in emerging markets, please get in touch. The proposal is to offer this as a model as a service solution via an application programming interface or API. And the idea is to make it as secure a service as possible. So investors that are interested in analyzing confidential data are able to do this while managing privacy, data security concerns. And we do this, we can talk more about it in the Q&A, but we do this in a way so we manage that for investors. We have our legal team and corporate business risk teams working very closely with us on ensuring that we are very mindful of how we manage third-party data, both data that we use as well as data that we would use the model to analyze. And then again, I think we've covered a lot of these. There are a number of different use cases for investors in appraisal as well as in portfolio. We're especially excited about work that we're hoping to start again in July around analysis of TCFD and Paris alignment disclosures, and we see this as a big focus of the model going forward. And want to just call out the number of climate risk terms we already have in the model, and are hoping to expand. We can go to the next slide, please. So I have to again here give a shout out to our data readiness team and our colleague Carlos Arias, who has done some incredible work around developing the MALENA-IFC taxonomy and thinking about, Florian explained the very detailed process that we've gone into. I truly believe the only reason we've actually gotten as far as we have is because we've had such an amazing team helping us with developing and creating data, which I think we will all reinforce is instrumental to that data science. And so we want to expand this taxonomy. This entire team is doing some very interesting work around taxonomy development, which is much more complicated, I think, than I certainly realized going into this project. And I'm absolutely in awe of all the thinking that goes into developing the way in which the model is taught. We want to continue to leverage expertise from our specialists through active learning. So there's a large pool of experts, both internal and external, that's available that can help with improving model performance. Florian already talked about the data and model governance framework and how important this is to our work. I saw some questions around languages. Yeah, again, great question. Right now, Malena can only understand English, but we recognize the importance of expanding this. And this, again, I think speaks to partnerships and collaborations with groups that have this expertise already. We have a number of publications in pipeline, and we will make sure to, I think we have the link to our website, so folks, please keep checking that out. We add new publications to that all the time. And again, Malena is currently in beta testing via an API service. If folks are interested in accessing the model intelligence, please get in touch. And if you have a solution or proposal for something that's not only about investments, we'd be interested in hearing about that as well. So I think this brings us to the end, and hopefully we have enough time to take some more Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Satya. That was great, and we've got some great questions since the last round. So let's just go through those. One question is, how much is the congruence between the analysis by Malena and experts?
Florian, do you want to take that? I mean, we have
Yes.
a number of different measures, including accuracy, but please.
Thank you, Tia. And that's a great question. So that goes back to model performance. When we look at our model and try to assess how well the model performs, our main measure is accuracy and F1 score. Accuracy is sort of the very straightforward idea that our ESG analysts provide those labels, those manually assigned positive, negative, neutral sentiments. And out of the total pool of those labels, we carve out one part for testing the model. So we use about 80–90% to train the model and then 10 to 20% to test the model on labels that the model has never seen before. which is really our ground truth. So we take a few thousand labels where we say this is what the ESG analyst says, and then we compare that to what the model predicts. And the overlap between those two is our accuracy score. So for those few thousand labels, if we take 10,000 labels for testing the model, Malena got about 9,000 of those right. That's 90%. So 9 out of 10 times, the model predicts the same score, the same sentiment as our human ESG analysts do. In addition to that, and that's sort of the standard way of assessing, and then we have F1 scores, which are a slightly more sophisticated way of measuring machine learning models in terms of how well they perform in terms of accuracy, but then also taking into account potential skews in the data set and chance and stuff like that. So, but they both are in the high 80s or 90% range, which we feel is very robust. But then in addition to that, we also do sort of recurring real life tests and assessments where we actually assign a few documents or a few cases to ESG analysts and specialists, and go in and go through each label in a real life example and say, do I agree? Do I disagree? Do I agree? Do I disagree? And the results there were very similar. I mean, 90% of the time, our group of testers agreed with what the model predicted. So that all goes towards the 90% performance that we that we achieved in a test set, but also in a real life sort of example.
Then Florian, maybe quickly, I mean, we just went through an extensive testing at the document level. Do you want to maybe give some quick insights around where the model was performing poorly, or where we had to see well, not poorly, but where we felt there was a need for adjustment?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the positive takeaway from that is if you think about our through sentiments, we have positive, negative, and neutral. And obviously the biggest concern would be if the human analysis says this should be negative and the model predicts positive, and vice versa. Now, if we look at our most recent assessment, those cases of model says positive, human says negative, or vice versa, make up a teeny tiny amount of the errors. So I think the total of that is 0.07% of error is because that's that contrast between positive and negative. The most typical case when we look at those 10% where the model doesn't have the same prediction as the human beings is between neutral and positive, or neutral and negative. So that may be that the human said, I think this should be negative, and the model said, oh, I think I'm more on the neutral side, which just speaks, I think, to the fact that ESG content isn't black and white. A lot of times there are some nuances, and just as maybe if you have two human individuals slightly disagree between negative and neutral, or neutral and positive, we have that disagreement with the model too. So I think the positive takeaway was that the concerning pieces between positive and negative were absolutely teeny tiny in the less than 1%. And then we are working on getting that neutral right, and saying, okay, can we add some examples of this should rather be positive, so we push the lever over to the positive side.
Thank you. Thanks, Aditi. Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to kind of pick a few questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go through all of them. One question is, how is the data privacy issue addressed when data is accessed from different stakeholders for processing?
Another really good question. So we are working, as I said, very closely with our legal and corporate business risk teams, both to manage the use of data sets. Also, the one statistic I don't think I covered was what IFC, as of the end of June, we would have 5,900 profiles of companies in the IFC universe of analysis. That, unfortunately, for exactly these reasons, is not information we can make public as yet, at least. And so we have to work very carefully around managing data sources that IFC uses to produce insights, and which is a large part of the reason we are proposing the solution we are for users, which is to access the intelligence via the Malena cloud environment. and use that in a safe and secure way. So IFC doesn't store any data, doesn't see any data. What we ask during beta testing is that if we can work with the beta testers to understand how the model is performing to the extent possible, so we can make sure it is fit for purpose. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, how have you dealt with gender gaps and gender blindness or social inclusion blindness in the documents that you have informed for the model and learning?
That's a great question. I mean, again, I think this goes to the need for us to have a team that really understands linguistics, understands how language works, and you know, a lot of the very complicated issues that either were not reflected in text 10 years ago and are emerging only now. And so to make sure that we continue to retrain the model, work with our experts who are really at the cutting edge of this. I think Florian and I will be the first ones to say we're not experts in gender issues. And it's really important for us to work. We have a large team of experts at IFC doing this work across the gender space. So it's really important for us to engage across the institution, both the IFC as well as the World Bank more broadly. We really, through experts that have been doing this work for much longer than we have access to really great resources. So we will be looking to do that, and it's really good to see questions like that, because I think it just speaks to the sensitivity of the model understanding. And then again, to go back to this point of active learning, we hope we can work very closely with experts who can help us continue to improve model performance by flagging, as Florian said, areas where the model is either neutral or not reflecting the right answer.
Thank you. Okay, this is actually a fun question. Is the model able to detect sarcasm, humor, and idioms with regards to sentiment?
Since Florian uses all of those, I'm going to let him handle that one.
Yes, and we use my language as an example for that. I mean, the serious answer though is that that's the exact point of language, natural language processing. I mean, even us humans struggle with that sometimes. I mean, we've all been in a situation where we were left thinking, was that serious or sarcastic or what is going on now? We do our best to pick up on those linguistical nuances, and to the extent that it is possible to do so based on a sentence, Malena is trained to do that. Now, if you take a sentence and really the telling is based on a wink of an eye or not, so that the sentence is exactly the same between serious and sarcastic. That's something where I think that technology, if you apply it to a single sentence, and that's how Malena works, will not be able to tell the difference, and is also not quite designed to do so, and even we would probably struggle with it. So there's certainly some areas that we can still explore and work on, but I do think that on a broader scale, to the extent that there are linguistic signs of that, the Malena model is supposed and trained to pick that up.
Thank you, Florian. I just want to say that while we're doing question answers, we do have a poll going. It's supposed to be on Slido. I don't know if you can see it or not, but Tigis has posted a link to it. It's just one question, and we would really appreciate your response just so that we can do better next time. It's on feedback. And that's right here posted by Tigis. But I'll go to the next question, which is from Jamie, who says, will Malena ever be able to provide an ESG score or a rating?
Yes, we are at present, what we are describing as sentiment scores is an analysis of unstructured text, as we said, through the 1200 word taxonomy sentiment lens. Maybe I should kick over to Florian to sort of emphasize what it's not, because I know you have a good answer for this, which is that, you know, what an ESG rating is and what the difference between those are. So I think we should clarify that, and again, this goes back to making sure users understand what are they looking at. It's very easy to look at, it's not as easy to look at a number and understand that there's a huge tome of text behind it. So Florian, maybe you want to round that out.
Thank you, Atia. And I was actually going to jump in at the end if you hadn't mentioned it, because we feel very strongly, and I'll just start with that. We feel very strongly that Malena is not supposed and is not designed to replace humans in their roles and human analysis. Malena is designed as a tool to empower and supercharge human analysis. So on that same note, Malena is designed to provide ESG signals, and those ESG signals can absolutely be used to calculate scores based on that. I do feel very strongly about the fact that we're not at a stage where, you know, whenever you hear rating, you think of credit ratings, which have a very robust and transparent methodology based on a lot of quantitative data, and I think have been tested for a very long time, and except for one point in time worked relatively well. But we're not there yet with sentiment analysis, but we are at a point where we can say, well, if we have enough data, and it's always important to remember that the score will be based on the data that we have, or if we build it in based on certain data gaps, but it is not supposed to replace that sort of critical thinking of humans, to put it in a larger context, to make additional analyses. So Malena is really supposed to help you find the points and connect some dots, but Malena is not supposed to then make a final assessment. And so when we talk about ESG sentiment scores, we talk about an aggregation of ESG signals based on the data that is available to the model for that analysis.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Florian. I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to wrap this up. So the last question is, are the ESG signals or word library available for sale, rent, or share?
At present, no, but I think the idea is, and we are certainly being encouraged to make as much of both the model as well as the taxonomy public. So the idea certainly is for us eventually to be able to do that, and we will take this into account when we decide that. I mean, ideally, we see this as in best case scenario as a global public good, and we're working very hard to make that happen.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I think with that, we will wrap up, and thank you everybody for their time. Tigis, I don't know if you want to say a few last words and maybe share the link to the longer feedback form, if you can share that in the chat.
Just want to say thank you everyone for your time, and have a great day, have a great evening, wherever you are. Thank you.